In a remote mountain town, where winter storms rage fierce and unforgiving, a young bride's dreams shatter like ice. 8 months pregnant and abandoned at a desolate train station, she faces nature's cruelest fury alone. The blizzard howls around, her snow piling higher with each passing minute, her hope fading like daylight in the gathering storm. Then, through the whiteout, a silhouette emerges, a lone cowboy, a man of few words carrying his own burden of loss. Without hesitation, he wraps her in his oilskin coat and guides her to safety. In his humble cabin, as the storm rages outside, something unexpected begins to stir. Could this chance encounter in nature's fury forge an unbreakable bond between two wounded souls? Sarah Mitchell's trembling fingers traced the wrinkled edges of the telegram one last time before tucking it into her coat pocket. The paper had grown soft from repeated handling throughout the day's journey. Its cruel message burned into her memory. Wedding cancelled, stop, do not come, stop, family will not receive you, stop. The words had struck her like physical blows when she'd first read them that morning in Boston. Now, as evening descended and the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall, their weight seemed even more unbearable. She pressed one hand against her swollen belly, feeling the reassuring movement of her child within. "We'll be fine, little one," she whispered, though her voice quavered. The rough wooden bench beneath her offered little comfort, and the small station office's windows had already begun to frost over. The station master had departed hours ago, leaving her with apologetic murmurs about the approaching storm and a family waiting at home. Sarah smoothed her travel-worn dress, a gesture that reminded her of more graceful days in Boston society. 8 months ago, she'd been the portrait of propriety, the daughter of a respected merchant. Then came Thomas Preston's charming smile and grand promises, followed by passionate declarations of love and hasty intimacies. When she'd told him about the baby, he'd sworn they'd marry, promised to bring her west to his family's ranch in Montana Territory. The ticket she'd purchased, with her last savings, had seemed like a passage to salvation. Thomas had described his family's sprawling ranch near Whitefish in such detail: the vast meadows, the sturdy main house, the welcoming embrace of his mother. All lies, she now realized, constructed to placate her until he could disappear. Wind whistled through the cracks in the station's walls, and Sarah pulled her inadequate coat tighter. The fancy Boston garment, once a source of pride, now seemed as foolish and impractical as her dreams of marriage. Outside, the snow was falling faster, the individual flakes merging into a swirling white curtain that obscured the mountains looming. Behind the station, she should have known better when Thomas's letters grew shorter, then stopped altogether. Should have recognized the warning signs when her own letters returned unopened. But hope, that most tenacious of emotions, had sustained her through the morning sickness, through her father's disappointment, through the whispers that followed her down Boston's cobblestone streets. The baby kicked again, more insistently. This time, Sarah rubbed her belly in slow circles, remembering her mother's stories about learning to trust her instincts. Her mother had passed when Sarah was just 16, but her wisdom lingered. "Sometimes, dear heart," she'd said, "the path we think we're meant to walk turns out to be just the road that leads us to our true destination." A particularly fierce gust rattled the station's door, and Sarah startled. The temperature was dropping rapidly now, and the small pot-bellied stove in the corner had long since gone cold. Night was approaching, and with it the full fury of the storm the station master had warned about. She had no money for a hotel, even if she could reach one in this weather. No way to return east, no future waiting in any direction. Tears began to fall, freezing on her cheeks in the bitter cold. The sophisticated young woman who had boarded a train in Boston was gone, replaced by someone far more vulnerable and perhaps, though she didn't know it yet, far stronger. She thought of her father's last words: "You've made your bed, Sarah, now you must lie in it." She hadn't understood then how literal those words would become, as she faced the prospect of spending a night on this hard bench, with only her coat and her regrets to keep her warm. The station clock ticked loudly in the gathering gloom, its hands moving with merciless precision toward nightfall. Sarah watched as snow began to pile against the window panes, transforming the world outside into something alien and threatening. The baby moved again, and she made a decision. She wouldn't spend the night in this frozen waiting room. Somewhere in this town there had to be a church, a boarding house, or a kind soul who would take pity on an expectant mother. Standing carefully, she gathered her small carpet bag, all she had left of her former life. The telegram crinkled in her pocket as she moved, a paper ghost of shattered promises. Sarah touched it one final time, then pulled it out and dropped it deliberately into the cold stove. Let the past burn, she thought, even as she wondered if she had the courage to face whatever waited beyond the station's door. What waited, though? She didn't know it yet. Was a destiny far different from the one she'd imagined when she'd boarded that train in Boston. As she pulled her coat tight and reached for the door handle, the wind outside rose to a howl, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what this young woman would do next. James Harrison hadn't planned to ride into town that evening. The storm warnings had been clear enough. Any man with sense would have stayed home, especially with the wind picking up the way it had. But something had nagged at him, an unfamiliar restlessness that drove him to saddle his horse despite the threatening sky. 20 years in these mountains had taught him to trust such instincts. The oilskin coat hanging from his saddle horn had weathered a decade of such storms. Its worn collar still bore the faint trace of lavender soap from when Margaret had last mended it, though she'd been gone these past 5 years. James touched the fabric briefly, a habit he'd never quite broken, before urging his horse forward through the thickening snow. The station emerged from the whiteout like a ghost, its windows dark except for one faint gleam. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks. Surely no one would be fool enough to remain here with a blizzard bearing down. Then he saw her, a solitary figure in a city coat, struggling to make her way down the platform steps. James reined his horse to a stop, watching as she nearly lost her footing on the icy boards. The woman's condition was immediately apparent, even through the swirling snow. 8 months along, he'd guess, maybe more. His hands tightened on the reins as he remembered another winter night, another storm, and promises he hadn't been able to keep. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The wind nearly stole the word away, but she heard it, turning toward him with a start. Fear flickered across her face, natural enough given the circumstances, but there was something else there too, a determination that reminded him of Margaret during those final difficult months. Without further hesitation, James swung down from his horse. The snow was already halfway to his knees as he made his way toward her. Up close, he could see how badly she was shivering, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that set alarm bells ringing in his mind. The coat she wore might have been fashionable in some eastern city, but it was about as useful as tissue paper out here. His fingers worked at the buckles of his oilskin coat, movements automatic after years of practice. The woman watched him warily, one hand protective over her belly, the other clutching a small carpet bag. When he held out the coat, she didn't move. "Storm's getting worse," he said, voice gentle as if coaxing a spooked horse. "Coat's warm, plenty of room for 2. He nodded toward her belly, letting her see he understood her condition. For a long moment, she seemed to weigh her options, though they both knew she had precious few. Then another gust of wind cut through her thin coat, and the decision made itself. She stepped forward, allowing him to drape the oilskin around her shoulders. The coat engulfed her small frame, but its effect was immediate. Some of the tension left her face as warmth began to seep back into her bones. James turned back to his horse, gathering the reins. He could feel her watching him, likely trying to decide if she'd made a terrible mistake in accepting his help. He kept his movements slow and predictable as he adjusted the stirrups. "My cabin's about 3 miles out," he said, not looking at her directly. "Wood stove, plenty of supplies." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You'd be welcome to wait out the storm there, or I can try to get you into town, though the road's likely drifted over by now." The woman, barely more than a girl really, straightened her shoulders beneath his coat. When she spoke, her voice was cultured, Eastern, but with a core of steel that made him think she might just survive out here after all. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, as proper as if they were meeting at a social function rather than in a howling blizzard. "And I would be very grateful for your help, Mr. Harrison," he supplied. "James Harrison." He held out his hand to help her mount, noting how small her fingers felt in his weathered palm. "Best get moving before this weather gets any worse." As he swung up behind her, James caught the faint scent of lavender mixing with the crisp, snow-laden air. His arms settled around her to take the reins, creating a protective circle that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. The old oilskin coat enveloped them both as his horse turned toward home, its brass buttons gleaming dully in the fading light like beacons guiding them through the storm. The brass bell on the horse's harness rang with each careful step, its clear tone cutting through the storm's howl. James had attached it years ago after getting turned around in a similar blizzard. Now its steady rhythm served as both compass and comfort as they made their slow progress through deepening snow. Sarah sat as still as possible, conscious of every movement's impact on their precarious balance. The shared warmth of the oilskin coat and James's solid presence behind her had stopped her shivering, but each passing minute brought new concerns. The baby was unusually active, perhaps sensing her anxiety, and she worried about the effect of the rough journey on her condition. "Easy now, Scout," James murmured to the horse as they approached what seemed to be a steep incline. Sarah felt his arms tighten slightly around her, adjusting the reins. "Ma'am, you'll want to lean forward a bit. Scout knows the trail, but it gets tricky here." She did as instructed, marveling at the sure-footed way the horse navigated what she now realized was a narrow mountain path. The bell's steady ringing continued, somehow reassuring in the white void that surrounded them. Occasionally, dark shapes that might have been trees or rocks loomed through the curtain of snow, only to disappear again moments later. "Your horse," Sarah ventured, partly to distract herself from their precarious position. "He seems very well trained." "Had him since he was a colt," James replied, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "Bred him myself. His dam was the smartest horse I ever knew. Passed that on to her son." He clicked his tongue, guiding Scout around what might have been a fallen log buried in the snow. "That bell saved both our lives more than once. Sound carries different in a storm like this, helps him navigate when visibility's poor." The bell chimed as if in agreement, and Sarah found herself focusing on its steady rhythm. It reminded her of the church bells in Boston, though those had last rung for her in judgment rather than salvation. The memory of disapproving faces and whispered conversations made her straighten her spine despite her fatigue. James seemed to sense her tension. "Not much further now," he said, his breath warm against her snow-dampened hair. "There's a stand of pines ahead that marks the turn to my property. Scout knows the way blind, which is good because that's about what we're working with tonight." As if to emphasize his point, the wind rose to a fever pitch, and the snow drove harder against them. Sarah ducked her head, grateful for the shelter of the oilskin. The bells ringing took on a frantic quality, matching her mounting anxiety as the horse pushed forward against the gale. Then suddenly, the wind died down. Sarah looked up to find they'd entered what appeared to be a grove of massive pine trees. Their dense branches created a natural tunnel, offering blessed relief from the storm. The bell's tone changed, becoming deeper and more resonant in the relative quiet. "The trees always shelter this stretch," James explained, allowing Scout to slow his pace slightly. "My grandfather planted them in a double row, knew they'd break the wind. Smart man, my grandfather." Sarah found herself curious about this man whose few words revealed careful thought and deep connection to the land. Did he build the cabin too? Started it. My father finished it, and I've been adding to it over the years. There was something in his tone, pride perhaps, but also a touch of melancholy. It's not fancy, but it's sturdy, keeps the weather out. The bell's rhythm changed again as Scout began to climb a gentle slope. Through the curtain of snow, Sarah caught glimpses of what appeared to be a clearing ahead. Then, like a vision, materializing from the storm, she saw it, a solid log cabin larger than she'd expected, with warm light glowing from one window. "Home," James said simply, and Scout's bell rang out one final time, clear and triumphant in the snowy night. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Though whether from relief or exhaustion or some emotion she couldn't quite name, she wasn't sure. The baby gave a strong kick, as if celebrating their arrival, and she placed one hand protectively over her belly. Behind her, James dismounted with practiced ease, his boots crunching in the deep snow. When he reached up to help her down, his hands were strong and sure, supporting her weight as if she were made of china. The brass bell chimed softly one last time as Sarah's feet touched the ground, and she found herself offering a silent prayer of thanksgiving for its guidance through the storm. The massive cast-iron stove dominated the cabin's main room, its black surface reflecting the lantern's glow as James led Sarah inside. It was an impressive piece, ornate scrollwork decorating its sides, multiple cooking surfaces on top, and a firebox large enough to hold logs that would burn through the night. Sarah could feel its residual warmth even from the doorway. "Need to see to Scout first," James said, helping her out of the snow-dampened oilskin coat. "Make yourself comfortable. Won't be but a few minutes." He hesitated, then added, "Stove's banked, but there's kindling and matches on the shelf if you want to build it up." Sarah nodded, discovering to her surprise that she wasn't afraid to be left alone in this stranger's home. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence he radiated, or the way everything in the cabin spoke of careful maintenance and honest work. Once the door closed behind him, she took a proper look around. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A narrow staircase led to what she assumed was a loft, and she could see two doors that likely led to bedrooms. Everything was scrupulously clean, if plain, with the sort of lived-in comfort that came from years of careful tending. But it was the stove that drew her attention again. Her fingers traced the manufacturer's name, Montana Queen, cast in raised letters across its front. The metal was smooth from years of use, and she could see where countless hands had polished certain spots to a gentle sheen. This was clearly the heart of the home, providing not just warmth, but a place for cooking, heating water, and gathering during long winter evenings. Following James's suggestion, she found the kindling and matches. Her father would have been shocked to see his daughter building a fire, but necessity had taught her many things these past months. Soon, flames were crackling behind the grate, and she felt the first real warmth she'd experienced since leaving the train. The baby kicked vigorously, responding to the heat, and Sarah sank into a sturdy rocking chair near the stove. It creaked, gently as she moved, the sound mixing with the pop and snap of the growing fire. For the first time since reading the telegram that morning, she felt her shoulders begin to relax. James returned shortly, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the scent of hay and horses. He paused in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots, and Sarah saw appreciation in his eyes as he noted the strengthening fire. "You've got a good touch with that stove," he said, moving to hang his coat on a peg. "Took me months to learn its ways when I first came here. It's particular about how it likes to be fed." "My mother always said that a stove was like a person," Sarah replied, surprised to find herself smiling at the memory. "It responds better if you pay attention to its moods." Something flickered in James's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or remembered loss. He moved to the stove, adding a larger log with practiced care. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Sarah watched as he filled a kettle with water from a pump at the sink. His movements were efficient but unhurried. A man completely at ease in his space. She would have liked this cabin. She believed in practical beauty, things that were lovely because they were well made and well used. James set the kettle on the stove, then began gathering supplies from various shelves. "I've got soup left from yesterday. Nothing fancy, but it's hearty. And there's bread I baked this morning." He paused, looking at her directly for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. "When did you last eat, Mrs. Mitchell?" The question, and his perceptiveness in asking it, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Sarah blinked them back, determined to maintain her composure. "It's Miss," she said quietly, "and I had some bread on the train, early this morning." He nodded, already reaching for a pot. "Soup first, then. Baby needs it." His matter-of-fact tone held no judgment, just simple understanding. He placed the pot on the stove next to the kettle, then pulled a rocking chair that matched hers up to the other side of the firebox. As the soup heated, filling the cabin with the smell of home-cooked meat and vegetables, Sarah felt the last of her fear begin to melt away. The cast-iron stove radiated steady warmth, its heat wrapping around her like a protective embrace. Outside, the storm raged on. But here in this sturdy cabin, with this quiet man who moved with such quiet purpose, she finally felt safe. The evening had settled into a comfortable quiet, broken only by the storm's muffled howl and the steady crackling of the fire. Sarah sat at the simple wooden table, finishing the last spoonfuls of surprisingly delicious soup, when she noticed the leather-bound album tucked into a nearby shelf. Its spine was worn smooth with handling, corners softened by time and touch. She might have overlooked it, but a photograph had slipped partially out, catching the lamplight. Without thinking, she reached to tuck it back in, and froze when she saw the image. A younger James, standing beside a dark-haired woman whose smile seemed to light up the faded sepia tones. The woman's hand rested on a clearly pregnant belly. "Margaret." James's voice was so quiet she almost missed it. He stood by the stove, coffee pot in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My wife." Sarah carefully withdrew her hand from the album. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." "No need for sorry." He poured coffee into 2 cups, adding a measure of cream to hers that she hadn't needed to request. "Been 5 years now. Sometimes I think the memories need airing, like wool blankets in spring." He brought the coffee to the table, setting her cup within easy reach. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled out the photograph completely. This was taken about a month before the fever took them both. The weight of those words settled in the room like a physical presence. Sarah found herself reaching instinctively for her own belly, an action James noticed with quiet understanding. "I was out checking fence lines when it hit," he continued, his voice holding the practiced steadiness of a story told many times in the privacy of an empty house. 3 days of hard riding, trying to get back through weather worse than this. By the time I made it home," he trailed off, fingers tracing the photograph's edge. "There was nothing you could have done," Sarah said softly, recognizing the guilt that lined his face. "Maybe, maybe not. Doctor said the same thing after, said the fever was too strong, that even if I'd been here." He shook his head, carefully sliding the photograph back into the album. "Still wake up some nights, thinking I hear her calling." The confession hung in the air between them, intimate as a shared secret. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, gathering courage. "My mother died when I was 16. For months afterward, I'd find myself turning to tell her something, forgetting she wasn't there." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Grief's got its own time, doesn't much care for our plans." "No," Sarah agreed, thinking of her own recent losses. Her father's rejection, Thomas's betrayal, the future she'd thought was certain crumbling like autumn leaves. "It certainly doesn't." They sat in companionable silence, sipping coffee as the storm rattled the windows. Finally, James stood, retrieving the album. Instead of returning it to the shelf, he placed it gently on the table between them. "Margaret would have liked you," he said, opening the album with careful hands. She believed in helping folks who needed it, said it was the only way to make sense of the hard things, turning them into something good for someone else. Page by page, he shared glimpses of his past. Margaret in the garden she'd loved, the cabin when it was newly built, his parents standing proud before the first barn raising. Each photograph was accompanied by quiet words that painted a picture of the life he'd lived, the love he'd lost, and the strength that had kept him going. Sarah found herself sharing too, stories of her mother's wisdom, her childhood in Boston, even careful admissions about Thomas and her father's harsh judgment. James listened without comment, but his eyes held a warmth that made her feel truly heard for the first time in months. As the evening deepened and the lamp burned low, Sarah realized something had shifted between them. The album on the table had become a bridge, spanning the distance between two wounded souls. Here was a man who understood loss, who had faced the worst life could offer and still found the courage to help a stranger in need. When James finally closed the album, his fingers lingered on its worn cover. "Getting late," he said gently. "You should take Margaret's old room, first door on the right. She'd want you to have it." The simple offer, heavy with meaning, brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. This time, she didn't try to hide them. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate for the gift of trust he'd given her. James just nodded, understanding all she hadn't said. Outside, the storm continued its fierce dance, but within the cabin's walls, two hearts had found an unexpected moment of peace. Dawn arrived with deceptive gentleness, soft light filtering through frosted window panes. The storm had blown itself out sometime in the night, leaving behind a transformed world of deep drifts and pristine white. Sarah woke to the quiet sounds of morning routine, the clink of the stove being stoked, the distant crunch of boots in snow, the gentle lowing of cattle in the barn. Margaret's room had welcomed her like an embrace, though clearly unused for years. It held lingering touches of feminine grace. A crocheted coverlet on the bed, a small mirror with painted roses on its frame, a brush and comb set arranged neatly on the dresser. Sarah had slept more soundly than she had in months. When she emerged, dressed in yesterday's clothes but feeling somehow renewed, she found James at his workbench near the window. Pale morning light fell across his shoulders as he worked, his hands moving with careful precision over a length of polished wood. "Good morning," she offered, one hand automatically steadying herself against the wall as she navigated the unfamiliar floor. James looked up, his expression warming slightly. "Morning. Hope I didn't wake you with all this." He gestured at the workbench, where curls of fresh-cut wood gathered like autumn leaves. "Not at all. I haven't slept so well since—" She trailed off, suddenly conscious of all the changes a single day had brought. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. He set aside his tools and lifted the piece he'd been working on. A walking stick, she realized, crafted from rich, golden wood. Its surface had been sanded glass smooth, with subtle curves that seemed to invite a hand's grip. "Noticed you were having trouble with your balance," he said, turning the stick to examine it in the morning light. "Natural enough, in your condition. Thought this might help." Sarah's throat tightened at the simple kindness. The walking stick was beautiful in an understated way, its lines clean and purposeful. When James held it out to her, she took it with trembling fingers. "It's hickory," he explained, watching as she tested its weight. "Strong wood, but not too heavy. Handles curved to fit a smaller hand." He paused, then added quietly, "Made one similar for Margaret, near the end." The stick felt perfect in her grasp, its smooth surface warming to her touch. James had carved subtle grooves where her fingers naturally fell, making it feel like an extension of her arm rather than a crutch. "I don't know what to say," she managed finally. "Thank you seems inadequate." "No need for thanks." He turned back to his workbench, beginning to clear away the shavings. "Storm's likely got us trapped here for a few days. Roads'll need clearing, might as well make the time useful." Sarah tested the stick, finding her balance with its help. Already she could feel how it would make movement easier, especially on the cabin's smooth wooden floors. How long do these storms usually last? Depends. This one dropped a lot of snow. He moved to the window, gesturing for her to join him. See those drifts against the barn? Probably 4 feet deep in places. Take a day or two just to dig out to the livestock. Looking out at the transformed landscape, Sarah felt a mix of awe and trepidation. The world had become a sea of white, broken only by the dark shapes of buildings and snow-laden trees. The walking stick provided welcome support as she absorbed the implications of their isolation. "I should help," she said firmly. "I may be with child, but I'm not helpless." James studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Could use a hand with the indoor tasks. Plenty of preserves need checking. Firewood to stack closer to the stove. But first," he moved toward the kitchen area with quiet purpose. "Breakfast. Can't work on an empty stomach." As she watched him begin the familiar ritual of morning cooking, eggs from the cold box, preserved bacon, coffee grounds measured with care, Sarah felt an unexpected sense of rightness. The walking stick in her hand seemed to ground her, providing not just physical support, but a tangible connection to this place and this quiet man whose kindness came without demands or judgment. Outside, the sun climbed higher, setting the snow-covered world ablaze with diamond light. Inside, the day's routine began to establish itself, as natural as breathing. Sarah found herself falling into step with James's rhythm, the walking stick, tapping softly against the floor as she moved about the cabin, learning its ways. The day had settled into a peaceful rhythm of shared tasks. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sorting through preserves while James cleaned his tack nearby. The walking stick rested within easy reach, already feeling like an old friend. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its early winter descent, casting long shadows across the snow. It happened when James reached up to adjust the lamp above his work area. The movement caused something to slip free from his shirt collar. A simple gold band suspended on a leather cord. The ring caught the lamplight, spinning gently before coming to rest against his chest. Sarah noticed how his hand moved automatically to touch it, a gesture as natural as breathing. Then, realizing she had seen, he hesitated before deliberately drawing the chain over his head. "Married her in spring," he said quietly, holding the ring in his palm. "She insisted on a gold band, even though we could barely afford it. Said some things were worth the sacrifice." His thumb traced the circle's smooth curve. "Couldn't bear to keep it in a box after. Seemed wrong somehow. Like locking away her memory." Sarah's hand stilled on the jar she'd been examining. "You honor her by keeping her close." James looked at her then, really looked at her, as if measuring the understanding in her voice. "Some folks think it's time I moved on. Say 5 years is long enough to mourn." "Grief doesn't work that way," Sarah replied, her own voice thick with memory. "My mother's been gone 9 years now. I still wear her locket." She touched the delicate chain at her neck, hidden beneath her collar. "People who haven't lost someone, they don't understand how you can both heal and still carry the pain." The ring gleamed in James's weathered palm as he considered her words. "Margaret used to say something similar. Said love wasn't like a cup that could only hold so much. Said it was more like a tree, always room to grow new branches without losing the old ones." "She sounds like she was very wise," Sarah offered, gently. She was. James's voice held a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Taught school before we married, had a way of seeing right to the heart of things." He paused, then added quietly, "Would have been a wonderful mother." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Sarah found herself resting one hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby's subtle movements. The simple gesture caught James's attention. "The father," he said carefully, not quite making it a question. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Thomas Preston, from a supposedly good Boston family." She straightened in her chair, chin lifting slightly. "He made all the right promises, said all the right words, then disappeared when I told him about the baby. His family sent that telegram yesterday, their final word on the matter. James slipped the chain back over his head, tucking the ring beneath his shirt. Man who'd abandon his own child ain't worth the breath to speak his name. My father said much the same, though his judgment fell more heavily on me. Sarah's fingers worried the edge of her apron, said I'd brought shame to the family, gave me a choice, give up the baby for adoption or give up my place in his home. So you chose your child, James said simply, no judgment in his tone. Yes, Sarah felt tears threatening but blinked them back. Though I hadn't planned on choosing a blizzard and a remote train station as well. Something shifted in James's expression. A softening around the eyes, a gentle understanding that made her breath catch. Sometimes life's worst moments lead us where we need to be. He touched the place where the ring rested against his heart. Margaret believed that, said everything had its purpose, even the hard things. Even this, Sarah gestured to encompass her condition, their isolation, the strange circumstances that had brought them together. James was quiet for a long moment, his hands returning to their work with the tack. When he finally spoke, his voice held a certainty that made her heart steady. Especially this. Found you in that storm for a reason, Miss Sarah. Don't believe in coincidences, not anymore. The simple declaration, delivered without dramatics or excessive sentiment, settled something in Sarah's soul. She watched as James returned to his task, his movements sure and practiced. The ring beneath his shirt caught the light occasionally, a reminder that the heart could hold both past and present, both grief and hope. Outside, the sun dipped below the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered world in shades of rose and gold. Inside, two people who had known profound loss continued their quiet dance of healing, finding in shared understanding the first delicate threads of something that felt remarkably like home. Sarah discovered the cradle on her third morning in the cabin, half hidden behind a workshop curtain. Early sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the partially completed piece, its sturdy pine frame already showing signs of expert craftsmanship, though only the headboard and one side were fully assembled. She stood examining it, walking stick-steady against the floor, when James entered from his morning chores. He paused in the doorway, snow melting from his boots, watching her reaction. "Started it last summer," he said finally, moving to hang his coat. Neighbor's daughter was expecting, lost the baby in her 7th month. His hand brushed the smooth headboard. Couldn't bring myself to finish it after. Sarah touched one of the carefully carved spindles. "It's beautiful work." "Been thinking," James said, his voice careful but determined. "Baby'll need somewhere to sleep. Could finish it if you'd like." He glanced at her, then away. "Make some changes to the design. Might add a gentle rocking motion, help settle them when they're fussy." The offer, so practically stated yet so deeply meaningful, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "You'd do that. Need to be ready." He moved to his workbench, beginning to sort through his tools with purpose. "Time's getting short. What are you, 8 months along now?" "Nearly 9, Sarah admitted, one hand cradling her belly. "Due just after the new year." James nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Thought as much. Weather'll make it hard to fetch the doctor when the time comes. Best to be prepared." He selected a plane from his tools, testing its edge with his thumb. "My mother was a midwife. Taught Margaret some before. Well, I remember some of what they discussed." The practical way he approached the situation, neither minimizing its seriousness nor allowing fear to overwhelm planning, helped steady Sarah's own nerves. She watched as he cleared space around the half-built cradle, his movements sure and methodical. "We'll need supplies," he continued, laying out his tools in precise order. "Clean linens, special tea for the pain, my mother's recipe. Got some in the root cellar, laid by for emergencies." He paused in his preparations, looking at her directly. "You're not alone in this, Miss Sarah. Want you to know that." The simple declaration, delivered without flourish or demand, touched something deep in her heart. Here was a man who had every reason to turn inward with his grief, yet chose instead to offer help to a stranger. "The runners will need to be just so," he said, returning to the cradle. "Too steep an arc makes for jerky movement. Baby won't." Like that. His hands moved over the wood with knowing care. "Need to sand everything smooth as silk. No rough spots to catch on blankets." Sarah found herself drawn closer, steadying herself with the walking stick as she examined the craftsmanship. The headboard bore subtle carved details, delicate pine, boughs and tiny stars worked into the wood with patient skill. "My father was a merchant," she said softly, "but my grandfather was a carpenter. I used to love watching him work. He said you could feel the wood story under your hands." James offered her a piece of the pine, freshly planed. "What's this one telling you?" She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the grain's gentle patterns. "Hope," she said finally. "It feels like hope." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. "Good wood for a cradle, then." He began measuring for the remaining side panel, pencil marking precise lines. "Thought we might add a small drawer underneath, useful for spare blankets, keeping them close at hand." The quiet scratch of his pencil, the solid presence of the walking stick supporting her, the morning sun warming the workshop, it all combined to create a moment of perfect clarity for Sarah. This man, this place, this unexpected sanctuary. Perhaps this was where she had been meant to end up all along. "Could you teach me?" she asked suddenly. "About the herbs, the midwife knowledge your mother passed down. I should know these things." James looked up from his work, approval warming his eyes. "Reckon that would be wise. We'll start with the tea herbs. Got a good store of them dried in the pantry. Later, I'll show you which ones grow wild come spring." He paused, then added quietly, "Though I'm hoping you'll still be here to see them bloom." The words hung in the air between them, an offer made, but not pressed. Sarah felt the baby move, as if responding to the moment's significance. Her hand found one of the cradle's smooth spindles, solid and real, beneath her fingers. "I'd like that," she said softly, "to see the spring herbs bloom." The leather-bound recipe book lay open on the kitchen table, its pages worn soft with use and spotted with cooking stains that told stories of meals long past. Sarah ran her fingers over the different handwritings that filled its pages. Some firm and bold, others delicate and flowing, each recording the history of the Harrison family through their daily bread. "Found it when I was clearing out the root cellar," James explained, setting down a basket of winter vegetables. "Thought you might like to see it. 3 generations of family recipes in there." Sarah carefully turned a page, admiring the neat columns of ingredients and instructions. "Your mother's writing?" "And my grandmother's." Margaret added some of her own, near the back. He moved to stand behind her, pointing to a recipe for apple pie. "That there's my grandmother's secret. Dash of vinegar in the crust. Makes it flaky as summer clouds." The morning light filtered through frosted windows as Sarah studied the book, her walking stick propped nearby. A week had passed since the storm, and while the roads remained impassable, they had settled into a comfortable routine. Now, examining the treasured family recipes, she felt a new connection forming. Not just to James, but to the generations of women who had made this cabin a home. "I have my mother's recipes memorized," she offered, touching a page that detailed bread-making techniques. She always said a recipe was more than just instructions. It was a way of passing down love through the generations. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. These mountain winters, good food means more than just filling bellies. It's about comfort, bringing warmth to cold days. He paused, then added quietly, "Been a while since I've had reason to cook proper meals. Mostly just basic fare these past years." Sarah found herself smiling. "Well, I may not know much about ranch work, but I do know my way around a kitchen." She turned to a blank page near the back of the book. "Would you mind, that is, would it be presumptuous of me to add my mother's molasses cookie recipe? They're particularly good in winter." Something softened in James's expression. "Reckon any recipe book would be proud to have it." He moved to his desk, returning with an inkwell and pen. Margaret always said a recipe book should grow like a family, always room for new additions. As Sarah carefully transcribed her mother's recipe, James began preparing vegetables for soup. The familiar sounds of cooking, the chunk of knife. Against cutting board, the bubble of water coming to boil, filled the cabin with domestic comfort. My father never approved of me spending time in the kitchen, Sarah admitted, finishing the last instruction. Said it wasn't proper for a merchant's daughter to cook like a common housewife. Out here we can't afford such notions, James replied, adding carrots to the pot. Every skill's valuable, whether it's mending fences or making bread. He glanced at her writing. Those cookies, they the kind that stay soft in the middle? If you don't overbake them. Mother's secret was an extra spoonful of molasses and watching them like a hawk in the oven. Sarah found herself reaching for an apron. Would you like me to make some? I noticed you have all the ingredients when I was organizing the pantry yesterday. James's eyes crinkled at the corners. Not quite a smile, but close. Wouldn't say no to that. Been a long time since these walls smelled of fresh baking. They worked together in comfortable silence, James at his soup and Sarah measuring ingredients for cookies. The recipe book lay open between them, its pages now holding one more story, one more thread in the tapestry of this mountain home. When the first batch of cookies came out of the oven, filling the cabin with the scent of molasses and ginger, James paused in his work. Taking one of the warm cookies, he bit into it carefully, considering. These, he said finally, would make your mother proud. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were healing tears. Here, in this kitchen, with its well-worn recipe, book and generations of memory, she had found something she thought lost forever, a sense of belonging, of carrying on traditions while creating new ones. As the winter day deepened around them, they continued their quiet dance of domestic harmony. The recipe book watched from its place of honor, its pages holding not just instructions for meals, but the very essence of home itself, love made. Untangible, through the simple act of feeding those we care for. Evening had drawn in early, as it tended to in these mountain winters, and Sarah sat in her now customary spot by the fire, knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. The blanket taking shape in her lap was a simple pattern, alternating squares of knit and pearl stitches, creating a subtle texture perfect for small fingers to explore. James entered from the workshop, bringing with him the scent of fresh sawdust. From his work on the cradle, he paused to add another log to the fire, then settled into his own chair, watching the smooth rhythm of her hands as they worked the soft yarn. My grandmother taught me to knit, Sarah offered, counting stitches. Said every baby should have at least one blanket made with love in every stitch. I started this in Boston, but she hesitated, remembering darker days. Well, I haven't had the heart to work on it until now. Good wool, that, James observed, eyeing the natural cream color. Local sheep. From your neighbor's flock, actually. Mrs. Henderson brought it over yesterday when she came to check on us. She insisted I take it, said her arthritis keeps her from knitting these days, and the wool shouldn't go to waste. The mention of their nearest neighbor, a widow who lived 3 miles down the valley, brought a thoughtful look to James's face. Catherine Henderson's got a good heart, lost her own baby, years back. She's been worried about you since I told her about, he gestured vaguely at the storm, their situation. Sarah's hands stilled on the needles. You've spoken to her about me. Had to. She's our closest neighbor, and with the baby coming, he met her eyes steadily. Needed her to know you were here, in case something happens, and I have to ride. For help! The practical consideration behind his words touched her deeply. Before she could respond, however, the baby gave a particularly vigorous kick, stronger than any movement before. Sarah gasped, one hand flying to her side. James was on his feet instantly, concern etching his features. Sarah? No, it's fine, she assured him quickly. The baby's just very active tonight. Another kick made her smile. Here, Without thinking, she reached for his hand. James hesitated for just a moment before allowing her to guide his palm to the spot where the baby was moving. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, as if responding to the warmth of his hand, the baby kicked again, strong and sure. The change that came over James's face in that moment was extraordinary. Wonder softened his weathered features, and something that might have been longing flickered in his eyes. His hand remained perfectly still against her belly, as if afraid the slightest movement might break the spell. "Strong little one," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Like its mother," Sarah replied, then added more quietly, "and perhaps like its father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. James's hand still rested against her belly, warm through the fabric of her dress. When he finally spoke, his voice held a certainty that made her heart skip. "Any child raised in this house would be my own," he said simply, "in all the ways that matter." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as she covered his hand with hers. The baby kicked again, as if sealing a promise. Slowly, reluctantly, James withdrew his hand and returned to his chair. Sarah picked up her knitting, but now each stitch seemed to carry new meaning. The blanket was no longer just a hopeful project, started in darker days. It had become a promise, a future taking shape one row at a time. "The pattern," she said after a while, holding up the growing square, "it's called Mountain Path," seemed fitting somehow. James nodded, understanding as always. Life's got a way of leading us where we need to be, even when the path looks rough at first. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and the needles clicked steadily. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes dancing in the lamplight beyond the windows. Inside, the half-finished blanket grew beneath Sarah's hands, each stitch binding them closer together. When the baby kicked again, Sarah found herself smiling, remembering the wonder on James's face. Perhaps her mother had been right about love, being worked into every stitch. This blanket would carry not just the love of a mother for her child, but also the unexpected gift of a man who could open his heart to both. The map lay spread across the kitchen table, its creased surface telling stories of years of use. Faded ink marked the familiar contours of the mountain range, while penciled notations in various hands recorded important landmarks, cattle trails, shelter caves, dangerous passes. James stood studying it intently, his finger tracing a path from their cabin to town. "Barometers falling faster than I've seen in years," he said, his voice grave. "Could be worse than the storm that brought—" "You hear?" Sarah set down the breakfast dishes she'd been washing, her walking stick tapping softly as she moved to join him at the table. 2 weeks had passed since that first storm, and her time of delivery grew ever closer. The thought of another severe storm sent a shiver of anxiety through her. "The Henderson place," James continued, pointing to a marked homestead on the map, "sits right here in the valley. Catherine's been watching the weather signs too. Says her rheumatism is acting up something. Fierce always means heavy snow coming." He moved his finger along a dotted line. "This here's the old mining road. It's our best chance of getting help if—" He paused, glancing at her rounded belly. "If we need it. But if this storm's as bad as I'm thinking, that road won't be passable. For days, maybe weeks." Sarah studied the map's weathered surface, noting the vast distances between settlements. "How long have you had this map?" "Was my father's before me. Every generation's added to it, marking new paths, dangerous areas." His finger rested on a cluster of small X's near a mountain pass. "These marks here? My grandfather lost 3 good horses in that pass before he found a safer route. Map's got our history written all over it." A gust of wind rattled the windows, making them both look up. The morning sky had taken on that peculiar grey cast that often preceded heavy snow, and the air held an ominous stillness. "What do we need to do?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite her concerns. James's expression warmed at her practical response. "Already moved extra hay into the barn loft. Got enough feed to keep the stock going for a month if needed." He began making new marks on the map with a pencil stub. These are the places I've cached emergency supplies, spare blankets, tinned food, medical supplies. Need you to know where they are, just in case. The implicit trust in his words touched her deeply. This map was clearly more than paper, and Inge, it was a survival guide, a family history, a testament to generations of hard-won knowledge. The baby, she started, then hesitated. Due in about 3 weeks by your reckoning, James finished for her. Might come sooner, might come later. Nature keeps its own schedule. He straightened, meeting her eyes directly. We need to be ready either way. Sarah nodded, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Tell me everything I need to know. For the next hour, James walked her through the map's secrets. Shelter spots, water sources, the safest routes down the mountain. His voice took on a teacher's patience as he explained how to read the weather signs, what different cloud formations meant, how to judge if ice would bear weight. Your walking stick, he added, has another purpose. He showed her how the notches, carved near the handle, could be used to measure snow depth, how the metal cap at its base could break ice if needed. Every detail had been thought through, she realized, from the moment he'd crafted it for her. A particularly strong gust shook the cabin, and Sarah instinctively moved closer to James. He reached out, steadying her with a gentle hand at her elbow. We'll be fine, he said softly, though his eyes remained serious. Cabin's solid, pantry's full, and you're stronger than you know. How can you be so sure? She whispered, voicing the fear she'd been holding back. James's hand moved from her, elbow to cover hers, where it rested on the map. Because you've already faced worse storms than this one, Sarah. Maybe not the kind that drops snow, but the kind that tests a person's spirit. And you're still standing. The simple truth of his words settled around her like a warm blanket. Outside, the wind continued to rise, and the first heavy flakes began to fall. But here in the cabin's safe haven, with James's solid presence beside her, and generations of wisdom spread before them on the weathered map, Sarah found her fears subsiding. Show me again, she said, pointing to the map's complex network of trails and markers. I want to understand everything. James nodded approvingly and began again, his quiet voice a counterpoint to the growing storm. Together they bent over the map, two people facing nature's fury, not as strangers thrown together by chance, but as partners preparing to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm had settled in with a vengeance, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of whirling white. As evening deepened into night, Sarah noticed James's restlessness, a tension in his shoulders as he moved between windows, checking and rechecking the darkness beyond. Finally, she understood. The enforced idleness was wearing on him, a man, accustomed to constant activity. Tell me about your guitar, she said suddenly, nodding toward the instrument that hung on the wall. Its warm wood gleamed in the firelight, strings catching golden highlights. James glanced at it as if seeing it for the first time in years. Was my father's, he said after a moment, used to play every evening after supper, said music was good medicine for worry. Would you? Sarah hesitated, then pressed on. Would you play something? He stood still for a long moment, and she feared she'd overstepped. But then he moved to take down the guitar, handling it with the careful reverence of a man touching a cherished memory. Dust had gathered on its surface, and he wiped it gently with his handkerchief before settling into his chair. The first few chords were hesitant, strings slightly out of tune from disuse, but his fingers remembered their work, and soon he had coaxed the instrument back to life. The melody that emerged was simple, but haunting, a folk tune that seemed to carry within it all the loneliness of the mountain winter. My mother loved this song, he said softly, still playing, called it winter's lullaby, said it was old as the mountains themselves. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. The baby stirred, as if also listening to the gentle notes. When she opened her eyes again, she found James watching her, something unguarded in his expression. Margaret used to sing, he offered, fingers still moving over the strings, had a voice clear as mountain spring water. We'd sit just like this, on winter evenings, sharing songs we knew. My mother sang too, Sarah said, the memory warming her, usually while she worked, cooking songs, cleaning songs. Said every task went easier with a tune. She smiled, remembering. Father complained it wasn't proper, but she never stopped. James's playing shifted, becoming something lighter. Know this one? To her surprise, she did. An old folk song about love and springtime that had been one of her mother's favorites. Without conscious thought, she began to hum along, then to sing softly. Her voice wasn't remarkable, but it was true, and it blended naturally with the guitar's mellow tones. The baby kicked enthusiastically, making her laugh mid-verse. I think someone approves of the music. James's hands stilled on the strings. May I? At her nod, he set aside the guitar and knelt beside her chair, placing his hand where she indicated. The baby obligingly moved again, and that same wonder she'd seen before transformed his face. Strong little dancer, he said, his voice rough, with emotion. Gets that from its mama, I'd say. Sarah found herself reaching out, touching his cheek before she could think better of it. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and he went very still at the contact. For a heartbeat, they stayed frozen in that tableau, his hand on her belly, her hand on his cheek, the storm howling unheeded beyond the walls. Then the baby kicked again, breaking the spell. James cleared his throat and moved back to his chair. But something had shifted between them. A boundary crossed, a new understanding reached. He picked up the guitar again, but now his playing was different, more confident, more alive. The songs flowed one into another as the evening deepened. Work songs, love songs, ballads that told stories of joy and heartbreak. Sarah sang when she knew the words, hummed when she didn't, and simply listened when the music grew too complex for accompaniment. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin something new was being born, as delicate as a first spring flower, as strong as the mountains themselves. When James finally set aside the guitar, the silence felt rich rather than empty. Sarah found herself reluctant to move, to break the magic of the evening. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your father was right. Music is good medicine for worry." "Been too long since these walls heard singing," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "Been too long since—" He trailed off, but his eyes said what his words didn't. Too long since there had been joy in this home. Too long since there had been someone to share music with. Too long since his heart had felt this way. The leather medical kit sat open on the kitchen table, its contents meticulously arranged. James stood checking each item against a list written in his mother's careful hand, while Sarah watched from her chair, one hand pressed against the persistent ache in her lower back. "Mother updated this kit every season," James explained, holding up a bottle to check its seal. "Said a midwife's bag was like a soldier's rifle, had to be ready when needed, no excuses." He set the bottle down with its fellows, each labeled in faded ink. "These are her special tinctures, pain herbs, bleeding herbs, calming herbs, each with its purpose." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, the baby's weight pressing heavily. The past hour had brought increasing discomfort, though she hadn't mentioned it yet. "Your mother taught Margaret about midwifery?" "Taught us both, truth be told." James began repacking the kit with practiced care. "Said a man ought to know. These things too, living this far out, never know when you might be the only help available." He paused, meeting her eyes. "How long have you been having pains?" The directness of his question startled her. How did you know?" "Been watching you shift position every few minutes. Seen you press your back when you think I'm not looking." His voice was gentle but firm. "How far apart?" Sarah felt tears. Threatening, of fear, of relief at being known so well, of gratitude for his quiet competence. "About 20 minutes, I think. Started around dawn." James nodded, continuing his methodical preparation of the kit. "That's good. Means we have time to get ready proper." He held up a length of clean white cord. "For the baby's cord. Mother's." Kit has 3, said 1 was never enough, 2 might fail, but 3 was magic. His matter-of-fact approach helped calm Sarah's rising anxiety. She watched as he laid out clean linens, positioned water to heat on the stove, moved her rocking chair closer to the fire. Every action was purposeful, planned, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. "I'm scared," she admitted finally, voicing the fear she'd been holding back. James paused in his work, coming to kneel beside her chair. "No, something. So am I." His honesty was somehow more comforting than false assurances would have been. But fear's got its purpose. Keeps us sharp, makes us prepare. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "We've done everything. We can to be ready. Now we trust in God and your strength." Another pain wrapped around her belly, stronger than before. Sarah gripped James's hand, breathing through it as Mrs. Henderson had taught her during her visits. When it passed, she found James watching her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly. "Seen it every day since you got here, where you faced your situation, learned new skills, made a place for yourself." He stood, still holding her hand. "This is just one more mountain to climb, and you won't do it alone." The simple declaration, delivered with such quiet certainty, brought fresh tears to her eyes. "James, She hesitated, then pushed on. "These past weeks you've become, that is, I've come to—" "Shh," he said softly, reaching to brush a tear from her cheek. "I know, me too." His touch lingered, gentle as a blessing. "But first, we bring this little one into the world safe and sound. Then we'll talk about all the rest." Another pain began building, and Sarah focused on her breathing, grateful for James's steady presence. When it passed, she found her voice. "Again, tell me about the kit, about your mother's medicines. It helps, hearing you talk." James returned to the table, though he stayed within easy reach. "Each bottle's got its story," he began, lifting one filled with amber liquid. "This one's made from willow bark and meadowsweet. Mother called it her liquid gold, said it could ease the hardest labor pains." As the winter afternoon deepened toward evening, James continued sharing his mother's wisdom, each item in the kit a testament to generations of knowledge passed down. Between contractions, Sarah listened, learning the secrets of mountain medicine, drawing strength from the legacy of strong women who had faced this challenge before her. Outside, the storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a pristine world of white. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and purpose, as 2 people, who had found each other, against all odds prepared to become 3. The medical kit sat ready, its contents a bridge between past and future, its presence a reminder that even in the wildest places, wisdom and love could light the way forward. The tiny booty lay forgotten on the table beside the medical kit, its soft white wool bright against the worn leather. Sarah had been working on the pair when the labor pains grew too intense to continue. Now, hours later, as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, that single booty stood as witness to the night's transformation. "Almost there," James murmured, his voice steady despite his obvious fatigue. He'd been unflagging through the long night, anticipating her needs, offering support without crowding, knowing when to speak and when silence was better. "You're doing so well, Sarah." She gripped his hand as another contraction built, stronger than any before. The willow bark. Tea had helped earlier, but now the pain was beyond any herb's power to ease. Through it all, James remained her anchor, his presence unwavering. "Can't," she gasped as the pain peaked. "I can't." "You can," he said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know." His free hand smoothed her sweat-dampened hair back from her forehead. "Remember what my mother wrote? The moment you think you can't go on is the moment you're almost there." Sarah focused on his voice, on the warmth of his hand in hers. The contractions were coming without pause now, each one building. On the last, James had moved her to the bed hours ago, positioning her where the lamplight was strongest. The medical kit stood open nearby, everything arranged with precise care. "Something's different," she managed between pains. "Something's—" "The baby's coming," James confirmed, checking her position with professional detachment. Then his voice softened. "Sarah, look at me." She met his eyes, finding strength in their steady blue depths. "Your body knows what to do. Trust it. Trust yourself." The next pain was overwhelming, primal. Sarah bore down instinctively, barely hearing James's quiet words of encouragement. Time lost all meaning, narrowing to this one eternal moment of becoming. Then, suddenly, everything changed. There was a moment of indescribable pressure, a sensation of release, and then the cry that filled the cabin was strong and indignant, full of healthy fury at being thrust into the cold world. Sarah fell back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as James worked quickly with supplies from the medical kit. "A girl," he announced, his voice thick with emotion, perfect and strong. His hands were sure as he tied off the cord, wrapped the baby in warm blankets, and placed her in Sarah's eager arms. The first meeting of mother and daughter was sacred, private. James stepped back, giving them space to discover each other. The baby's cry softened as she found her. Mother's warmth. Sarah counted fingers and toes, marveling at their miniature perfection, memorizing every detail of the tiny face. When she finally looked up, she found James watching them with an expression that made her heart swell. "Would you like to hold your daughter?" He started at the word "your," emotion flickering across his features. "You mean that with all?" "My heart." James sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Sarah placed the baby in his arms. The contrast of his large, weathered hands against the tiny bundle was breathtaking. He cradled the baby with infinite tenderness, and when she wrapped her fingers around one of his, tears spilled unashamedly down his cheeks. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome home." The pale winter sun was rising in earnest now, sending rays of golden light through the frosted windows. Sarah watched as James crooned softly to the baby, looking for all the world, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. Her eyes fell on the single booty still lying on the table. "I never finished the pear," she said, fatigue making her slightly giddy. "Our daughter's going to have cold feet." "Our daughter," James repeated softly, testing the words. Then he smiled, a real, full smile that transformed his entire face. "Well, we can't have that." Still holding the baby securely with one arm, he reached out with his free hand and took Sarah's fingers in his. "Marry me?" The question was simple, unadorned, perfect. Sarah squeezed his hand, joy bubbling up through her exhaustion. "Yes." As if in blessing, the baby made a small, contented sound and snuggled deeper into James's arms. The single booty caught the morning light, its white wool glowing like new snow. Soon enough, there would be time to finish its mate, just as there would be time for all the other pieces of their life together to fall into place. For now, in the quiet dawn of this new day, they were complete. Mother, father, child, bound. Together by love stronger than blood, by choice stronger than chance. The marriage certificate lay on the judge's desk, its formal script a stark contrast to the simple wooden furniture of his home office. The courthouse in town remained snowbound, so Judge Harrison, James's uncle, had agreed to perform the ceremony in his parlor. The document's blank spaces waited to be filled, much like the future stretching before them. Sarah sat in a comfortable chair, baby Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. 2 weeks had passed since the birth, and mother and daughter both bloomed. With health, Mrs. Henderson had arrived the day after Grace's arrival, blazing a trail through the snow with her old mare and a determined spirit. She'd stayed a week, helping Sarah regain her strength and sharing the 1,000 small secrets of motherhood. "Everything's in order," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority despite the informal setting. "Though, I must say, this is one of the more unusual ceremonies I've performed." His eyes twinkled as he looked at his nephew. "Trust James to find his bride in a blizzard." James stood by Sarah's chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Sometimes the best gifts come unexpected," he said quietly. The judge nodded, understanding in his weathered face. Margaret would approve, he said, then turned to Sarah. My nephew's first wife was a remarkable woman. She'd be glad to know her home was filled with family again. Sarah felt James's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder. I wish I could have. You'd known her, she said softly. You'd have liked each other. Mrs. Henderson offered from her place by the fire. She'd insisted on standing witness, along with her grown son, Thomas. Margaret always said this valley needed more strong women. Judge Harrison picked up his pen, its nib catching the winter sunlight. Shall we begin? The sooner we make this official, the sooner you can get back to that fine cabin of yours. Storms brewing again. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. The judge's words, shaped by years of joining couples in matrimony, spoke of commitment, understanding, and the sacred trust of family. When he asked for their vows, James and Sarah had ready responses, formed in the quiet moments of the past. Weeks as they cared for Grace together. I take you as my wife, James said, his voice steady and sure. To share all that I am and all that I have, to raise our daughter in love and wisdom, to walk beside you through whatever storms may come. Sarah blinked back tears as she responded, I take you as my husband, grateful for the shelter of your strength, the warmth of your heart, and the gift of your love for both Grace and me. Where you are is home. Grace stirred in her sleep. One tiny hand escaping her blanket to curl around her mother's finger. The judge smiled at the sight as he began filling in the certificate's blank spaces with careful penmanship. Names and dates, he murmured, the formal parts of what's already been written in your hearts. His pen scratched across the paper, recording for posterity the union of James Michael Harrison and Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. Below that, he added a note about Grace, officially recognizing James's role as her father. There, he said finally, sprinkling sand to dry the ink. Just needs your signatures and young Grace's footprint as witness to her own adoption. Mrs. Henderson helped with the baby while Sarah and James signed their names. Then, with infinite care, they pressed Grace's tiny foot to the ink pad and then to the paper, marking her forever as a Harrison. It's done, the judge declared, affixing his seal. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you man and wife, and declare this little one officially part of the Harrison family. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, but inside the warm parlor, no one seemed to notice. Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes, her son smiled broadly, and the judge looked on with quiet satisfaction as James helped Sarah to her feet, still, holding Grace. Ready to go home, Mrs. Harrison? James asked softly. Sarah looked up at him, seeing in his eyes all the love and certainty she felt in her own heart. Home, she agreed. Where we belong. The certificate dried on the judge's desk, its formal language somehow inadequate to capture the miracle it recorded. How a storm, a chance meeting, and an act of kindness had forged a family stronger than blood, truer than any convention. In its neat script lay the official recognition of what their hearts had known since that first night. They were meant to find each other. The wooden box of garden seeds sat open on the kitchen table, its compartments filled with carefully labeled packets. Some were store-bought, saved from previous years, while others contained seeds collected from the Henderson family's generations-old plants. The March sun streamed through windows that Sarah had spent the morning washing, making the scattered seeds gleam like tiny jewels. Margaret's garden diary, James said, placing a worn notebook beside the seed box. She kept detailed records of what grew best, when to plant. He opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. These here are her notes about the kitchen garden. What to plant where, which vegetables need morning sun, which do better with afternoon shade. Sarah shifted Grace to her other shoulder, the baby's warm weight, a now familiar comfort. At 3 months old, their daughter was thriving, her personality emerging more each day. She had James's blue eyes and Sarah's dimples and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. It's perfect, Sarah said, touching the diary's pages with reverent fingers. I've been wondering how to plan the garden. Everything's so different. Here from what I knew in Boston." James moved to stand behind her, one arm circling them both as he looked down at the diary. "Margaret believed in companion planting. See here?" He pointed to a carefully drawn diagram. "Beans and corn together, the beans climb the corn stalks, marigolds between the rows to keep pests away." "Smart woman," Sarah observed, leaning back against him. "The gardens I knew were all straight rows, everything separate and proper. This seems more natural, like life," James agreed. "Everything supporting everything else, each plant with its purpose." He reached into the seed box, picking up a packet of morning glory seeds. She loved these, said they reminded her that beauty's just as important as practicality. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Through the newly cleaned windows, they saw Mrs. Henderson approaching on her sturdy mare, saddlebags bulging with what looked like more seed packets. "That woman," James said fondly, moving to open the door, "never misses a chance to help a garden grow." Sarah smiled, remembering how Catherine Henderson had taken them under her wing. The older woman had become like a mother to her, sharing not just practical advice about babies and gardens, but the deeper wisdom that came from years of mountain living. "Sarah, dear," Catherine called out as she dismounted, "brought you some of my grandmother's bean seeds, drought-resistant and tough as old boots. Just what you need for this climate." She paused to chuck Grace under the chin before setting her burden on the table. "And how's my favorite goddaughter today?" The next hour passed in pleasant discussion of garden plans. Catherine added her own knowledge to Margaret's notes, suggesting which varieties would do well in the mountain soil, when to plant what, and how to protect tender shoots from late frosts. "You'll want to extend the garden," she said, sketching on a spare page. "With a growing family, you'll need more space." She glanced meaningfully at Sarah and James. "Children need fresh vegetables, and I've a feeling Miss Grace won't be an only child for too long." Sarah felt herself blush, even as James's hand found hers under the table. They hadn't spoken of more children yet, but the possibility hung sweet in the air between them. "The herb garden, too," Catherine continued, either not noticing or kindly ignoring their reaction. "Every mountain wife should know her medicines. Sarah's got a good hand with the healing herbs. Could be a blessing to the whole valley in time." The afternoon light began to soften as they sorted seeds into planting order. Grace dozed in her cradle, the one James had finished just before her birth, while the adults planned for growing things. Each seed held promise: sustenance for their family, beauty for their home, medicine for those in need. "Found something else in the root cellar," James said when Catherine had left. He brought out a small glass jar filled with bright orange seeds. "Margaret's prized calendula, said they're good for healing and for lifting the spirit. Thought you might like to plant them near the kitchen door." Sarah took the jar, holding it up to the light. The seeds seemed to glow from within, like captured sunlight. "For the past and the future," she said softly. "We'll plant them together." James pulled her close, dropping a kiss on her head. "Come spring, this place will bloom like never before. New life everywhere you look." Through the window, they could see the last patches of snow retreating from the garden plot. Soon the earth would be ready for planting, ready to support their dreams and feed their hopes. The seed box sat open between them, each packet a promise of things to come: summer vegetables for their table, flowers for their joy, herbs for healing, and love growing stronger with each passing season. The family portrait sat in pride of place on the mantel, captured by a traveling photographer who'd passed through the valley as winter gave way to spring. In the image, James stood tall and proud, one hand resting on Sarah's shoulder as she sat holding Grace. The baby wore the christening gown Mrs. Henderson had preserved from her own children's baptisms, its delicate lace a striking contrast to the sturdy cabin walls behind them. What the photograph couldn't show was how far they'd come in the year since that fateful blizzard. It couldn't capture the sound of Grace's laughter as she took her first toddling steps, or the way James's eyes still softened every time he watched Sarah singing their daughter to sleep. It couldn't reflect the deep contentment that had settled into the cabin's very bones. turning a house of memories into a home of new beginnings. Sarah stood at the mantel now, adjusting the portrait's simple frame. Outside, the June sunshine bathed the flourishing garden in golden light. Margaret's calendula bloomed bright as flame near the kitchen door, while climbing beans spiraled up cornstalks just as the old garden diary had advised. "Thinking deep thoughts?" James asked, coming in from his morning chores. He slipped his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him, savoring his solid presence. "Remembering?" she replied softly. "1 year ago I thought my world had ended. That telegram, the storm, feeling so lost." She turned in his embrace to face him. "I never dreamed I was actually finding my way home." James brushed a tender kiss across her forehead. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "brings beauty from ashes, joy from sorrow." From her blanket by the fire, Grace let out a happy squeal, proudly holding up the wooden horse James had carved for her. The sunlight caught the gold of her curls, so like her mother's, while her blue eyes, her father's eyes, sparkled with mischief. "She's growing so fast," Sarah mused, watching their daughter play. "Soon she'll be running everywhere, getting into everything." "Good thing we're adding that new room then," James said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Reckon we'll need the space before too long." Sarah's hand flew to her still flat stomach, wonder blooming in her chest. "How did you know?" "I was going to tell you tonight. Been watching you in the mornings. How you turn a bit green at the smell of coffee." His eyes crinkled with joy. "Just like with Grace. That and you've been humming to yourself more lately. Always seems to mean something's on your mind." Tears of happiness sprang to her eyes as James pulled her close again. From her play spot, Grace watched them with innocent curiosity, then raised her arms to be included. James scooped her up, and they stood together, a family portrait more precious than any photograph could capture. "I never thought I'd have this," Sarah whispered against his chest. "A true home, a loving husband, beautiful children. And I never thought I'd love again," James replied quietly. "After Margaret, thought that part of my life was over. Then you showed up in that storm, and everything changed." Grace patted their faces with her small hands, demanding attention. They both laughed, the sound echoing off the cabin walls like music. The afternoon light shifted, catching the crystal prism Mrs. Henderson had given them as a wedding gift. Rainbow colors danced across the family portrait, across their faces, across the room that had witnessed so much healing and hope. "The garden's coming up strong," James said after a moment. "Margaret's flowers, your herbs, our vegetables all growing together, kind of like us, past and present, all tangled up in something new and beautiful." Sarah touched the portrait's frame one last time before turning toward the kitchen. "Speaking of gardens, we should invite Catherine for supper. Share our news. She's been dropping hints about more grandbabies for months now." "Already invited her," James admitted with a grin. "She'll be here at sunset, bringing one of her apple pies." As Sarah moved to prepare their evening meal, she paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before her. James sat in his chair by the fire, telling Grace a story about mountain flowers while she played with her wooden horse. The family portrait watched over them from the mantel, a testament to love's power to heal and transform. Outside, the garden bloomed in riotous color. Bees hummed in the calendula, and the mountain peaks stood eternal guard. Inside, the cabin held all the warmth and joy Sarah had ever dreamed of finding, and more she'd never dared to hope for. She was home, truly. Home, and every day brought new blessings to count.